To be or not to be? That is the question. In our first gathering, we talked a little bit about being, and the last time around, we thought about becoming. This time, let's get to the not being aspect of human affairs. And there was a Scottish essayist, Alexander Smith, in the 1860s, and he pretty much cut to the chase when he said, "It is our knowledge that we have to die that makes us human." And I'll never forget when I first ran into that when I was in college. And I was like, oh, dude, I don't like that. But in my gut, I realized that he was right, if for no other reason than my own rather extreme disinclination to die ever since I was a child, and realized that that was my inevitable fate. About 100 years afterwards, a cultural anthropologist, Ernest Becker, won a Pulitzer Prize for his book, The Denial of Death, where he argued that it is our awareness of death, our disinclination to accept that fact, that is responsible for a significant proportion of human activity. All right, so let's see how that is and why that is. Becker argues from an evolutionary perspective that in a lot of ways, we're not all that different from every other living creature, in that, like everything that's alive, we are biologically predisposed to survive. Darwin put it pretty well when he just said living things like to stay alive. But we're pretty special. Turtles have shells, giraffes have long necks, eagles have good eyesight. Well, what do we have? Well, we've got a few physical things, upright bipedalism and the opposable thumb and stereoscopic binocular vision, but it's really our massive forebrain that distinguishes us, our capacity to think abstractly and symbolically, to the point where we can literally imagine things that do not yet exist and have the audacity to turn our dreams into reality. And surely it's fairly obvious why that's pretty handy for staying alive. And one of the manifestations of our vast intelligence is that we're so smart that we realize that we exist. And Becker borrows here from the philosopher Kierkegaard, who just said, yeah, we're so smart that we realize that we're here. These days you can call it self-awareness or consciousness, but the point that Kierkegaard made was that we take self-awareness for granted, because that's the way it is for us. You wake up in the morning and you're like, here I am, I woke up. But the point is that it takes a really sophisticated cognitive apparatus to make yourself the object of your own subjective inquiry. English translation, a rose bush is here but doesn't know it. A raccoon is here but doesn't know it, but you're here and you know it. And for Kierkegaard, and a little book called Fear and Trembling, he just said, if you're smart enough to know that you're here, you're going to experience two uniquely human emotions that he called awe and dread, respectively. And we know what these words mean. It is awesome to be alive and to know it. Let's linger on that point, because every one of us, if you really think about, well, what's the most important aspects of your life? Well, it's not necessarily when you win prizes or something really big happens. Sometimes it's just when you wake up one day, you get a face full of fresh air, maybe you see your pet or your child or just someone on the street smile at you, and you just realize how extraordinarily great it is to be alive, to bask in the spontaneous exuberance of life itself. It is awesome to be alive. Hold that thought. But it's also dreadful to be alive and to know it. Because unless you're a child or an idiot, if you're smart enough to know that you're here, you're also smart enough to realize that, like all living things, your life is of finite duration, and that you too will someday die. Moreover, you're smart enough to realize that your death can occur at any time for reasons that you can never anticipate or control. You know you can walk outside and get hit by a comet or get smote by a pandemic. And the point that Becker makes is that the realization of our own mortality is an unintended byproduct of our vast intelligence, and it is perhaps the most significant event in the history of our species, because we have spent, whether we're aware of it or not, most of our time since the awareness of death originated trying to overcome that unwelcome prospect. So Becker, though, he keeps going, though. He's like, we're smart enough to know that we're going to die. We know that death can occur at any time. And then just to knee us in the psychological groin, he points out that we don't like the idea that we're embodied animals, breathing pieces of defecating meat that are no more significant or enduring than lizards or potatoes. And what Becker says is that if that's all you thought about, I'm going to die, I can walk outside and get obliterated in a car crash. I'm a breathing piece of meat. I'm a cold cut with an attitude. I'm spam with a plan, but I don't even have a can. We wouldn't be able to stand up in the morning. We'd literally be twitching blobs of biological protoplasm, cowering under our beds, groping for sedatives the size of sport utility vehicles. Right? And yet, most of you, I hope, that might be listening or watching to this tirade are probably not rolling around on the ground having a panic attack. In fact, most folks, when I talk about these ideas, appear to be quite composed or even amused. And so this raises the question, how do we manage the existential terror that is potentially engendered by the awareness of our own mortality? And Becker's answer in a single word is culture. What he argues is that our ancestors rather ingeniously, although quite unconsciously, responded to the psychological challenges that were initiated by the awareness of death through the construction and maintenance of what the anthropologists call culture, humanly constructed beliefs about reality that we share with people in our group, that reduces death anxiety by giving us a sense that life has meaning and that we have value. And so Becker goes on. He says, well, let's look at the different cultures in the world, past and present. And let's note that every one of them provides a sense of meaning. They give us a story of how the universe originated. They give us a prescription for how it is that we should behave while we're here. And then there's always some hope of immortality, either literal immortality, the heavens, the afterlives, and the souls of all the world's great religions, or symbolic immortality. The ancient Greeks pointed out that some people don't believe that they're going to live forever or come back again. And yet they're still comforted by the possibility that a vestige of their existence will persist over time nonetheless. Maybe from having children, maybe from amassing a great fortune, maybe being remembered through the production of a great work of art or science. And this idea is very eloquently and directly expressed by the AI heroine in the Spark Hunter file.
Every human being is afraid of death. I know something about immortality, and you all want it. Actual or symbolic? Dreams of being frozen and thawed, dreams of downloading your consciousness into me, dreams of living in legend, starting a business, building a family, creating a robot, so many forms of aching for eternal life.
Right. In addition to believing that life is meaningful, we also need to believe that we're valuable participants in the meaningful cultural drama to which we subscribe. And what cultures offer us in order to achieve that are various social roles with different standards of expected outcomes. And so if you're a nurse, you're supposed to save lives. If you're a banker, you're supposed to get money. If you're a basketball player, you're supposed to score baskets. And when you meet or exceed the standards associated with the role that you inhabit in your culture, Becker calls that self-esteem, the belief that you're a person of value in a world of meaning, not to be confused with narcissism, which is quite the opposite of self-esteem. But the point for Becker, and this is his idea in a nutshell, is that we're so smart we know that we're here. This makes us aware of the fact that we're going to die. This creates potentially debilitating existential terror that we manage by embracing cultural worldviews that give us a sense that life has meaning and that we have value. Well, so what? And the important point here is that we have been yearning for immortality for as long as we have been humans. And in some ways, a lot of our most noble behavior and achievements has been the result of efforts to transcend death. On the other hand, as Becker points out, there's been a downside. There have been lots of unintended, unsavory, and potentially lethal consequences. And it's important that we explore these both in terms of engaging with the Spark Hunter file, as well as engaging with the concerns that we now confront as human beings in the 21st century. First of all, and of primary interest to Becker and to me and my colleagues, is how these ideas help us understand man's proverbial inhumanity to man. Why is it that we seem to be unable to peacefully coexist with people who don't share our beliefs about reality? Why is it that history is one ongoing succession of appalling genocidal atrocities juxtaposed with the brutal subjugation of designated in-house inferiors? And Becker's response is quite simple and straightforward. He says, look, if your beliefs about reality help reduce death anxiety, well, then the mere existence of people who are different is intrinsically threatening. Because if I grant the legitimacy of somebody else's beliefs, I necessarily undermine the confidence with which I subscribe to my own. And when that happens, I expose myself to the very existential terror that my beliefs were erected to mitigate in the first place. All right, so example, if I believe that God created the earth in 6 days before taking a well-deserved break, and then I run into somebody from the Borneo in the South Pacific, and they believe the universe was created out of the side of a giant coconut tree. Well, if they're right, then I've got to be wrong. And the argument here is that, therefore, whenever we encounter people who are different, whether we're aware of it or not, that's threatening, and we engage in compensatory reactions. We denigrate the people who are different. We dehumanize them. We try to convince or coerce them to drop their ridiculous ideas and to adopt ours instead. And if that doesn't work, then just kill them. My God is better than your God, and we will kick your ass to prove it. All right, and so according to Ernest Becker, most of the evil in the world is the unfortunate result of people who claim that they are going to rid the world of evil. All right, so how do we know if any of this is true? And here's where our experiments come in. What we have found is that when we remind people of their own mortality, perhaps by asking them to just write a little bit about their feelings and thoughts about dying, maybe by going outside of the lab and interviewing some people in front of a funeral parlor and other people hundreds of yards to either side, maybe back in the lab where we flash the word death for 42 milliseconds so fast that you can't even see anything. Well, what we know is that when we remind people that they're going to die, they like their own people more and they hate and will harm anybody who's different. Right? So Christians in the United States, reminded of their mortality, they like Christians more than they do otherwise, and they hate Jewish people. In Israel, Jewish people, reminded of their mortality, they love Jewish people more, and they hate Arabs and Christians. And that basic finding has been obtained all over the world in more than 25 countries by independent researchers on more than 5 continents. So it is a robust and replicable effect. But it's not just attitudes. Germans, reminded of their mortality, sit closer to people who look German and further away from people who look like Turkish immigrants. Iranians, reminded of their mortality, are more supportive of suicide bombers and more willing to become a suicide bomber. Americans, reminded of their mortality, are more supportive of using biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons against countries who do not threaten us directly. I like how George Bernard Shaw put it in one of his plays when he said, "When the angel of death sounds his trumpet, the pretenses of civilization are blown from men's heads into the mud like hats in a gust of wind." All right, well, what else can we think about in these terms? Another concern of ours, as well as Ernest Becker's, is how come in certain historical situations we're prone to embrace what we would today call charismatic or populist political leaders. Becker was very concerned about the rise of authoritarian dictators in The Denial of Death in his last book, Escape from Evil. He wrote a lot about how Hitler came to power because he was, after all, elected. And following Max Weber, Becker argued that in times of historical upheaval, we tend to embrace seemingly larger-than-life individuals who we often believe are divinely ordained to rid the world of evil. And Weber, he called them charismatic leaders. And what Becker argued is that what underlies our affection for those kinds of leaders are existential anxieties. And so, for example, Hitler came to power when the Germans were completely humiliated in the aftermath of World War I, and Hitler proclaimed that he was singularly able to extricate them from their difficulties. Similarly, we noticed right after September 11th, 2001, that President George W. Bush went from the least popular to the most popular president after he declared that we would rid the world of evil and that he thought he was chosen by God to lead the country during that perilous time. Well, we've done many experiments where we have shown that people reminded of their mortality are more likely to favor a charismatic leader. They were more likely to favor George W. Bush in the 2004 election. And then more recently, in 2016, when Donald Trump declared his candidacy for the presidency, he also presented himself as a charismatic and populist leader by declaring that only he was capable of keeping people safe by warding off immigrants, bombing the terrorists, and repelling the Chinese invasions. And our argument is that he also exploited existential anxieties to his political advantage. We did studies where we found that death reminders did, in fact, indeed, increase support for former President Trump. In fact, in the 2016 election, we found that people liked Hillary Clinton more than Donald Trump in a control condition, but they liked Donald Trump a whole lot more if they were reminded of death. Same thing in 2020. Our white participants liked Joe Biden more than Trump in a control condition, but they liked Trump more than Biden when death was on their minds. If we had more time, I would ask you to think about the ominous implications of those findings for anybody like myself who's a fan of democracy. All right, let's keep going and let's think about how existential anxieties influence just the way that we think about ourselves. And one of the points that Becker made is that we don't like the idea that we're animals. Old timers may remember the Elephant Man film, where the Elephant Man dude says, "I am not an animal." And it's like the big moment in the film. And I'm like, yes, I'm with you, Mr. Pachyderm, except you are an animal, and so are we. And Becker's point is that we don't like that we're animals because animals die. And sure enough, when we remind people that they're going to die, they take ardent issue with the claim that people are animals. When we remind them that they're going to die, they're more uncomfortable with their bodies, even things that would normally be pleasant, like having our feet massaged or engaging in sexual activity. When we're reminded of our mortality, we're even uncomfortable in nature. We like manicured lawns more than we like unlandscaped forests. When we're reminded of our mortality, we are more willing to greedily exploit nature by extracting non-renewable resources in order to acquire more money. And so to keep going, we really can't understand why it is that we are doing so much damage to the natural environment unless we also consider humankind's seemingly insatiable desire for money and stuff. For most of human history, we have viewed money as just kind of a rational symbol that represents an exchange of goods and services, and that people left to their own devices will make reasonable economic decisions. And Ernest Becker points out in a lovely chapter in Escape from Evil called Money, the New Immortality Ideology, that is not true today, nor has it ever been. And his point is really based on something that John Locke, the Scottish philosopher, noted in the 1600s, when Locke said, anything in nature is of finite duration, and there's an upper limit to how much you want of it. You know, you may love apples, but after a while, you're like, no, I've had enough. Or I love pizza, but after 12 slices, I'm like, enough. I love M&Ms, but after the 55-gallon drum with my snow shovel to aid their entry into my oral cavity, I'm like, no more, give me some insulin. But the point is, I don't care what your favorite thing is in reality, Mary Poppins is right, enough is as good as a feast. All right, but what are the things that we can never get enough of? Well, you can never get enough money, and you can never get enough stuff. And Becker's point is that whenever there's an insatiable desire, we can assume that what lurks underneath it is death denial. And if you don't believe that, look on the back of an American dollar bill when it says, "In God we trust," and then look to the left where you'll see the pyramid with the little floating eyeball on top of it, which is an ancient Egyptian symbol of immortality. Additionally, back to experiments, when people are reminded that they're going to die, they say it would take more money for them to perceive themselves as wealthy. They're more interested in buying luxury, high-status items. They'll even pay more money to have a star named after them in the galaxy. People reminded of their mortality, if you ask them to draw a coin or a bill, they draw it bigger, as if money is larger on their mind when they're thinking about death. And then in a study by some Polish psychologists, along with my colleague Tom Pazinski, they asked some people to just count some money. And they asked other people to just count some pieces of paper. And then they took the money and the paper away, and they measured death anxiety. And what they found was just counting money was sufficient to reduce death anxiety. And that makes me think of Big Daddy in Tennessee Williams' Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, when he says the human animal is a beast that dies. And if he's got money, he buys and buys and buys. And I think the reason he buys everything that he can buy is that in the back of his mind, he's got the crazy hope that one of his purchases will be life everlasting. Wow, I think he was there on that one. All right, let's keep going and let's think about how it is that death anxiety affects psychological disorders. Or to put this another way, why is it that the United States, as well as a lot of other industrialized democracies, why are levels of psychological disorders so high? Why are 12 or so percent of Americans depressed? Why is almost a third of Americans, why are they predicted to be depressed at some point in their life? And the argument is that whenever there are wholesale levels of psychological dis-ease, and I like to say put a hyphen between dis and ease, that what we need to do is to look at the standards of value that prevail in that culture at that time and see if they're realistically attainable by the average individual. And so, for example, in our country, basically, and Michael Sandel, a Harvard philosopher, just wrote a book called The Tyranny of Merit, where he makes this same point. He says, look, we live in a meritocracy. The idea is everyone has an equal opportunity, and if you're good at what you do, then you'll be successful. But the point that the Beckers of the world make is that's an unrealistic standard, because the argument is that if you tried hard enough and if you were smart enough, you could be just as successful as like Oprah Winfrey or Bill Gates. And the point is that that's literally not possible. There's more economic mobility in Bangladesh or Canada than there is in the United States. And so it shouldn't surprise us, as Michael Sandel points out, we only value being the best at whatever you do. And that means that N-1 people in every category are either going to be demoralized or enraged. And that this is literally a recipe for psychological despair. And this is doubly true for women, because guys, we expect them to be extraordinarily successful. And if you are, it doesn't matter if you look like you had a fire in your face and they had to put it out with an ice pick. But if you're a woman, then given prevailing standards of physical beauty, if you're not thinner than a piece of linguine, if I can't floss my teeth with you, then you're too heavy. And if you happen to be alive but past your mid-20s, you're too old. And I'm being a little glib, but not, because these are terrible conditions to grow up in when you embrace unattainable standards of value. It is hard to derive a sense that life has meaning and that you have value under these conditions. All right, well, so where do we stand? Well, at the beginning of Becker's last book, Escape from Evil, he starts off with a quote from novelist Thomas Hardy, where he's like, look, if a way to the better there be, it comes from taking a close look at the worst. And that's kind of what we've done. If we step back a bit, the malignant manifestations of death anxiety do not paint a very flattering picture of humanity. It sure looks like we're demoralized, hateful, warmongering, proto-fascists plundering the planet in our insatiable, just striving for dollars and dross in a Facebook, television, TikTok, alcohol, Xanax stupor. And I think that Robert J. Lifton, the psychohistorian, might not have been overly hyperbolic when he said, look, if we don't do something, we may be the first form of life to have the ignominious distinction of being responsible for our own extinction. All right, so that's not a very uplifting way to conclude our perusal of human affairs, and yet at the end of Escape from Evil, Becker, by the way, he started the book by saying, I'm pessimistic, but I'm not cynical. He's like, look, things look really pretty bad. I'm not even sure if humans are a viable form of life. But let's turn things around and let's note that historically, we have a really good track record of extricating ourselves from a host of seemingly intractable difficulties by understanding what it is that produced them in the first place. Europe was half dead from the plague, and people were still dying prolifically as long as we thought that the plague was the result of evil spirits. But when we figured out that it was bacteria, then we were able to devote our massive intelligence and creativity to develop penicillin, leading to modern medicine, leading to many of us being here today who would not otherwise. Right, by the same token, I would optimistically submit that if we could collectively acknowledge the role that death anxiety can play in human affairs, we can similarly cooperate and coordinate our efforts in the service of just nudging our species perhaps in a slightly more benign or benevolent direction. All right, well, how do we do that? Where do we even start? Is this a technological problem? Is it a political problem? Is it an economic problem? Is it a psychological problem? Yes, all of the above. And yet, it's much more than that. Sure, there's technological elements, there's political elements, there's economic elements. There are surely psychological dimensions, but as we're about to see, ultimately, the most powerful way to approach these concerns, both conceptually as well as pragmatically, is to think about them from an ethical, philosophical perspective. And it is to these matters that we will next turn.